Good morning. We are going to be in a few short verses in Proverbs 15 this morning. I think that's page 538-ish in your Pew Bible. I looked at it a few minutes ago, but I spend so much time around our seniors, my memory is fading. I love you all very much. So we are continuing in our series titled Don't Be a Jerk. Ironically, your sermon this morning is delivered to you by a jerk, speaking on the topic of not being a jerk. So we're going to talk about the tongue this morning, and Proverbs 15 is short, the 4 verses that we'll look at, but there's a lot of power there. My wife likes to play a game at dinner time where she asks us, would you rather live in a cottage in the mountains or in a condo right on the beach? And of course, we have to really hem and haw about, well, I don't know, would we want to be, putting sunblock on the kids, all 4 of them every day, multiple times a day? Well, not really, but, the mountains have this and that, but, you don't get the beach and the ocean, and temperature obviously is going to vary a lot more, so you really have to wrestle through some of that stuff. So I thought this morning we could play a similar game, you and I. So, would you rather, door number 1, Thanksgiving dinner, turkey, not the overdone sort, but the perfectly succulent, juicy, best turkey you've ever had, the mashed potatoes with the gravy, whether you want the brown or the white, it doesn't matter, you pick, right? This is your fantasy. You can have cranberry sauce, you can have the Watergate salad, the green stuff with the jello, the pistachio jello, and the marshmallows, and the pineapple, and the walnuts, right? You can have that. And there's the yams, and of course the yams, they have to have marshmallows on them too. And if you want green bean casserole, you can have that, or maybe you want just green beans that have been simmered for a while with bacon in there. And of course, you can't forget the rolls, right? Rolls with lots and lots of butter. Is there anything I'm forgetting from Thanksgiving dinner? Stuffing, right? Yeah. And do you do just the traditional stuffing or the sausage stuffing? Right? That's the kind Jesus eats, I'm pretty sure. The sausage stuffing, right? So we've got that in door number 1. Now, door number 2, you ready for it? Is a can of Spam. All right, who's going with door number 1? Anyone brave enough for door number 2? Okay, we have a couple of outliers there. All right, let's try it. We'll do one more. All right, so door number 1. Here, I'll switch it up for you just to, you never know. Right, so door number 1 is 2 weeks in Maui. Right? It's peaceful, it's quiet, it's beautiful. All right, we have door number 1 already. Right? It's not the main island where you've got, too much commercialization and the crowds and everybody's going everywhere and there's the touristy stuff. Maui is really it's the place where you get the real Hawaii. Right? All the beauty, none of the busy bustle and hustle, right? 2 weeks of that, all you can eat, right? All included, as much shrimp scampi as your heart can devour, in a 5-star resort. Do they have 5 stars or is it just 4-star? I don't spend a lot of time in Maui. All right, so that's door 1. Door 2, 2 weeks in prison. All right. For door 1, who do I have? Okay, and for door 2, Okay, all right, a couple of outliers again. All right, we'll have to check them on the way out. So did someone take their temperature before they came in? All right, so obviously the answer there is obvious. No one in their right mind, I love you guys, is going to pick the spam or the 2 weeks in prison over the 2 weeks in Maui or the perfect Thanksgiving dinner. So as we look at Proverbs 15 this morning, we are presented with a similar choice for our tongues. Wisdom versus folly, health versus destruction, good versus evil. It's Deuteronomy 30 all over. Deuteronomy 30, God says to Israel, look, today I set before you life and death. So choose life that you may live. Your tongue is powerful. Wield it very carefully. If you don't hear anything else this morning, hear that. Your tongue is powerful. Wield it very carefully. Let's read our 4 verses in Proverbs 15. Solomon writes, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise commends knowledge, but the mouths of fools pour out folly. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. A gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. The word of the Lord. So we're going to go sort of verse by verse. You may notice, sort of in the Bert and Ernie style, that one of these verses isn't like the others. Verse 3 kind of sticks out, sort of like a sore thumb. So we're going to tackle 1, 2, and 4, and we'll save 3 for a little bit later. So verse 1, you may have heard this from me before, that like begets like. Right? A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Now, I know most of you are familiar with the book of Proverbs. Much of the book of Proverbs is communicated to us by way of parallelism, right? We have 2 lines or couplets, you might say, in poetry, and that parallelism is often synonymous, which means that you have one line and then the second line follows it up, basically saying the same thing, but with different words to give it a different kind of flavor. In verses 1, 2, and 4 here in chapter 15, we've got antithetical parallelism. So what that means is the first line says something generally positive or usually positive, and the second line is a negative or the antithesis of, the opposite of what was communicated in the first line in order to again form a full or more flavorful thought, if you will. So our verses here are antithetical parallelism. So the author's trying to communicate something through the use of both terms or both statements. And I would say that the primary thing that he's trying to communicate here is that like begets like. Now, we know that just instinctively or naturally, right? Zebras don't give birth to giraffes. Cows do not give birth to velociraptors. Human beings do not give birth to Tasmanian devils, usually. In this case, a soft or I'm going to try and say something here that's not heretical. So, the book of Proverbs, if you look at it in different translations, you get fairly different wording, right? The NIV and the NASB and the ESV and the NET and the King James and various translations will give you different things. So if you look at it in the ESV, it says a soft answer. If you look at it in the NIV, it says a gentle answer. If you look at it in, I think it's the RSV, it's a tender. So remember that we're looking at poetry here, and there are idioms that are included in it, and there are certain things that are difficult for us to wrap our brains around from a translation perspective. So, for instance, one of my favorites, The second line here, verse 1, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Literally stirs up anger. Lift the nostrils. Okay, I think actually a wooden, just one-to-one translation is for stirs up anger, lifts the nostrils, is flares the nostrils, right? When someone becomes angry, right? So you're trying to work through some of these things from a translation perspective, and we're trying to figure out idioms and connect it one-to-one, and that's challenging. So as we go through this, I'm going to talk about some of the various ways in which it could be translated. That's not to negate your faith in the translation that you have in your laps. It's to say that language is challenging at times, and there's a great deal that's being communicated here that you will miss if we don't try and capture all of the flavor that Solomon is using. So a soft or a gentle or a tender answer turns away wrath. We see that soft answer, that gentle answer, actually giving birth to a soft or a gentle or a tender response. And it does more than that remarkably. This gets into the beginning of the power of the tongue to affect someone else's emotions and someone else's behavior. It does more than just simply elicit or beget a soft or gentle or tender answer from them. It actually can have the power to take them from a position of anger or wrath to soft or tender or gentle. Some of you may have small children. Every once in a while, small children tend to shout things that they don't necessarily mean at their parents, like, I hate you, and I never want to see you again. Dad in our house doesn't usually respond with a soft answer. That generally doesn't elicit a soft answer from Dad, but Mom says, well, I love you. Do you know who comes and gives Mom a big hug more often than they come and give Dad a big hug? The kids that shout, I hate you, and I never want to see you again. Because Mom returns their wrath or their anger with a soft or a tender or a gentle answer. Now, the second half of that verse is a harsh word stirs up anger. Harsh or painful. It's actually the same word that's used for pain in childbirth or pain in the toil that Adam is cursed with when he works the ground. And I just sort of envision someone just stirring a pot, right, and working a person up to anger. And remarkably, the same thing is communicated here in the second half of the verse, that like begets like, right? If I give out gentleness or kindness or tenderness, then I likely am going to get that back. If I give out harsh or painful words, if I try and wound, I'm likely going to be the recipient of some anger. But don't lose sight of the fact of how powerful the tongue is in that transaction. The tongue is actually the primary vehicle that's eliciting the responses. I have some very verbal children. Sam, when he was 3, Sam's my oldest, but when he was 3, you may not believe this, would often express his feelings about any particular error that his parents had committed, and he would tend to berate us for minutes at a time. And when he was about 3, his brother was about 1.5, and it was a Wednesday night, and I was taking Sam to the church for kids club, and Mom was staying at home in order to put Lucas to bed because, again, he's 1.5. And I hop in the car and I say, "Ooh, we're low on gas." And Sam says, "You should stop for gas, Dad." And I say, "We're fine. We'll make it." We get halfway there, and we run out of gas. And I call Mom and I say, hey, I'm really sorry. I know you just put Lucas down, but I ran out of gas. And she says, all right, I'll bring the gas can. So we wait for 15 minutes, and for the entire 15 minutes, Samuel is sitting in the back seat, in his car seat. I told you that we should have gotten gas, and you didn't listen to me. And now I have to sit here in the back of the car, and we're going to be late for church, and it's getting dark, and I don't even have a book, and I'm starting to get hungry, and there's nothing to eat, and how long are we going to be here? And that just went on and on and on for 15 minutes. So I tell you that story to say that we experienced a number of those beratings, earned or unearned. And at one point, I had had enough. This wasn't the same car trip. But after a while, I looked back and I said to Samuel, you don't have to say every little thing that pops into that little brain of yours. And my 3-year-old responded back, I don't have a little brain. You have a little brain. Like begets like. And a harsh word stirs up anger. Now, this particular verse is interesting because there's really a flip side of it, and there's not the same moral contingency to it that there is in verses 2 and 4. It's more just, I would say, common sense advice that he's giving here. So I wouldn't say that this is saying you should never say a harsh word, right? I think of Jesus, right? And here's a good test, right? Did Jesus say harsh words? Yeah. He generally said them to the religious elite, to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He called them things like sons of Satan or whitewashed tombs, or said that they were great at converting people to hell. Those are harsh words, right? Sometimes it's necessary to say harsh things. Sometimes you can't always be gentle. But the verse in Proverbs 15 here, is by and large communicating that you can expect that the way that you communicate with people is going to beget the way that they respond to you. Not always. Sometimes it's different, and sometimes you have to respond in a way that you have to ignore how they're going to treat you, right? You can't not share the gospel because you think that might elicit a harsh response. All right, so verse 2. The tongue of the wise commends knowledge, but the mouths of fools pour out folly. So there are various translations for commends. Some say adorns. The NASB says that the tongue of the wise makes knowledge acceptable, which I think is interesting. I think maybe a better rendering of that makes it receivable, something that that you would want or desire. Adorns or commends, I think almost of an advertisement for knowledge, right? Whereas the fool just simply spews it out. It bubbles over. There's really no control to it. And so, as we're comparing and contrasting the two aspects of the couplet here, right? The wise person who commends knowledge or who adorns knowledge spends time with knowledge. They put effort and time into knowledge. They recognize and they sift through and they organize and they sort. Whereas the mouth of the fool, there's no filter. None whatsoever. My favorite comedian is Jim Gaffigan. He talks about McDonald's because he likes to go to McDonald's, and that tends to shock anybody that he says that too. And I like his retort to that. McDonald's sells 1 billion hamburgers a day. There are only 300 million people in this country. I'm no mathematician, but I think everybody's lying. And of course, we all know, and he responds or retorts the typical line for McDonald's, right? It's really bad for you. And it's high in fat and calories, and we don't even know where the meat comes from. And we all say, that's disgusting. I'll have a Big Mac, a large fry, and a 2-gallon drum of Diet Coke. And he says, we know it's bad for us, but it tastes delicious. And we just eat it with no thought, no reason behind it. It's easy. It's easy to do the work of the fool, to simply pour forth folly, to vomit it out, to have things come across our Instagram feed or our Facebook, whatever you call that. I can't do Facebook anymore. And just simply share, or to hear this or that about the political election and just simply spew that out. The wise, the tongue of the wise commends knowledge. They take their time. They get to know their subject matter, and they make the things that they talk about and the things that they entertain and the things that they tell other people appealing. It's something that people want to have. We're doing this study over the next several weeks because this is a time in our country's, existence. I was going to say calendar, when this sort of uncivil dialogue pops up, and we tend to say things that are more to identify who we are and how we feel than to commend or adorn knowledge. It's a really good test. If you're going to talk to anybody in the next, 37 days? How many days is it till the election? Who knows? Oh, come on. All right. Yeah, in the next 37 days, ask yourself, does this thing that I'm about to post, or is the thing that I'm about to tell this person, or the way that I'm about to respond about Biden or Trump or racial inequality or social justice or fill in the blank, is it adorning knowledge? Is the person that I'm communicating to, are they going to grab a hold of that and say, that is worth thinking about? It's a good test. Now, like I said, one of these is not like the other, so we're going to skip over verse 3 and go straight to verse 4. A gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. Again, you can see like begetting like there, right? Look at that. The gentle tongue leads to life-sustaining material, but perverseness actually crushes a person's soul. This verse, I don't know if you catch it or not, but it really drips with language from Genesis, from the creation and from the fall. The big giveaway, who knows what the big giveaway in this verse is for Genesis? Tree of life. Yeah. Tree of life is one of the things. Spirit, right? The Spirit, same word that we have of the Spirit hovering over the surface of the deep when it's just a giant ball of water. Before he actually brings order to things, we see the Ruach, the Spirit. And then we actually see, I think, a good term for what happens to the image of God between Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. It becomes perverted. One thing that's really important to remember as you consider and think about the power of the tongue is that we were made in the image of God. And we were made in the image of God by the spoken word of God. Right? God created everything, seen and unseen, by his mouth. And he didn't just create it, but Colossians tells us that he sustains it, that his word is so incredibly powerful that as he spoke it into existence, it also continues to sustain. Things hold together because God's speech is so incredibly powerful. And verse 4 in chapter 15 tells us that we have not a divine power in our tongues, right? We're not creating and sustaining things. But we have a remarkable power. And when we speak, we have the opportunity to be true and legitimate image bearers or horribly, horribly marred image bearers. Because we can either lead people to a tree of life or we can crush their spirit. And it's interesting that Solomon says that when your tongue is perverted, right, perverted, when it's not being used the way that it was intended, when it's not being used in order to reflect the image of God, you crush your fellow man's spirit. And interestingly enough, you reject the work of the Spirit in your own life in order to lead someone to something that is life-sustaining. So you forsake the good and you embrace something that was never intended. Now, a while back, I said, what if I gave you door 1 or door 2, right? And there were ridiculous options. Solomon has actually set in front of you ridiculous options. You can either pick health or destruction, good or evil, life or perversion. You get to pick those every time you communicate with your fellow human beings. Why in the world would you ever pick door number 2 when you have door number 1 at the ready all the time? Now, what does the tree of life look like? What is the thing that we can lead people to? Well, the easiest answer there is the gospel. The literal translation of a gentle tongue in verse 4 is a healing tongue, is a tree of life. The absolute easiest way that we can use our tongues in order to bear the image of God, in order to lead people to something that sustains life, is to introduce them to Jesus Christ, the one who has died for their sins in order to reconcile them to God. Now, that's a pretty basic one, right? I mean, if I was in the promised land teaching the 4 and 5-year-olds, and I said, all right, what's the answer here? All they have to do is say Jesus, right? And they're right, okay? So the gospel is a pretty basic one. We've skipped over verse 3, and I want to look at verse 3. There are lots of directions that we could go with verse 3. There are many things that we could talk about there. But I want to use verse 3 as the answer for how you can use your tongue to lead people to a tree of life. Verse 3, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. Right? We could talk about how that there is incentive for us to be careful with our tongues because God is watching. It's also incentive for others who don't know the Lord to be careful with their tongues and everything else they do, right? There's really a double-edged sword here that God sees, right? That God's eyes are everywhere, watching on the evil and the good. There is a culture out there that is terrified and tearing itself apart. And there's a tree of life that we can communicate to them about every aspect of it. Do you know why? Because God sees. He doesn't miss the good and the evil. He knows what's happening. I forget who told me the other day, God already knows who's going to win the election, and he's not losing any sleep over it. Never mind the fact that he doesn't sleep. Not every illustration is perfect. God sees. Are you concerned about injustice? Are you concerned about the way that the church responded in the midst of slavery? Are you concerned about the way that we respond now when it comes to social matters? God sees that. God knows what he's doing and is in control. He sees the good and the evil. And there's something in the heart of believers that is satisfied and hopeful and at rest because we know that God is in control. To hear that he sees, right? If he just saw and stayed back and wasn't ever part of what we do, that wouldn't be all that comforting to us. But to hear that he sees and to know how he acts in your life and in your life and in your life, to know that he sees the good and the evil and he sent his son, that he sees the good and the evil and he knows what's happening with the election, to know that he sees the good and the evil and he knows what's happening with the economy or your retirement savings or your job or your lack of a job. That God sees and that he knows what he's doing and that he has a plan and that he won't let justice go unpunished, that he cares for us more than he cares for the birds and the flowers that are already taken care of, that God sees is a message that will lead people to a tree of life. You have an opportunity every time you communicate with them to pick the tongue of folly that just simply spews forth more of the McDonald's junk that we ingest. Right? And I'm speaking metaphorically there. Right? There's a lot of junk in our culture that we just gobble up and we just spew it right back out. You can invest that in them, or you can invest words that remind them and that give them hope and a future, because God sees. Your tongue is really powerful. Wield it very, very carefully. Let's pray. Father, your word is good, and it points out to me the goodness of your Spirit and of your good gifts that are always at our fingertips, always at the edge of our lips. God, that there are things that we can take advantage of. You set before us, just like you did with Israel in Deuteronomy, life and death. And you don't set before us life and death and step back and have no preference about what we choose. You want us to choose life. And God, there's this sin nature within us that Paul in Romans 7 reminds us causes us to do stupid things and to pick the things that we don't want, to pick, obviously, the wrong door. Lord, help us by the power of your Spirit to overcome our sin nature and to choose the things of life, to choose the things that breathe life into our own bodies and spirits and that breathe life into the bodies and spirits of the people you have created. Lord, I pray that you would use your word to sink it deep into our hearts in order to change the way that we think and the way that we live, and especially the way that we speak. Lord, make us different than everybody else in our culture. I pray these things through the Son and by the Spirit. Amen.